Okay, everyone, please welcome Dean Abbott onto the podcast today. He's the Chief Data Scientist at Appriss Retail and is also a speaker for us at different events, instructors at times for TDWI events. We're going to talk today about, unlocking the potential of generative AI, a topic I think a lot of folks are going to be very intrigued by. I'm sure they're all, clamoring to hear what Dean has to say on the topic because, in our lives, AI seems to be in every conversation that we have around business at this moment. And of course, as I mentioned, we're going to highlight the virtual summit that's coming up here in 2 weeks. And I'm excited to talk to you, Dean. How are you doing today? Thank you so much for joining.
It's great to be here, Andrew. And yeah, I'm doing great today.
Good. All right. So before we jump into all the good questions about generative AI, Dean, can you give us a little bit of background about yourself, how, what you do and how you got to where you are today, please?
Yeah, I've been in the tech space and statistical learning and predictive analytics and data science. Like back, I usually joke before it was called data science, before it was called predictive analytics, before it was called data mining, all those things I've been doing since the late 80s. So it's really been my whole career back before people cared. And then people started being intrigued by it. And that's more the machine learning style of things. And AI, of course, has really taken off on its own right in the last few years. But I've worked for companies, a lot of DoD doing missile guidance, radar, sonar, and then later I became a consultant for 15 years as an independent consultant in a wide range of applications, building predictive models, including for the IRS to find fraud and abuse on tax returns.
Hmm.
Uh, Co-founded a behavioral marketing company that was acquired about 3 years ago. And last May, I just started with Appriss Retail as their chief data scientist.
Amazing. Wow, yeah, I mean that's a wealth of experience that you have there. And it sounds like, over that course of time, the importance has only grown as you mentioned there in that. And certainly the attention, maybe the importance has always been there, but the attention to the importance I think has certainly increased.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so let's dive in here, and I'm going to start this one off, with a little piece of research. My research director, Fern Halper, helped me craft this very first question, so I want to give her a quick shout out. But she let me know that according to our research here at TDWI, only about 10% of companies across all industries that we have surveyed have generative AI applications in production. Now, many are claiming to be, experimenting with it, maybe in process. So, Dean, what are you seeing? Are you seeing that percentage hold true? Tell us a little bit about that, please.
Yeah, and that's what I've observed. Of course, we're all at a disadvantage unless you do a research like Fern has done, and be able to interview lots of companies. It's hard to see, but just from what I've seen in speaking at events, I've spoken at machine learning events in the US and in Europe in the last year. And that's exactly what I'm seeing. If it's 10% or 15%, whatever that percentage, or maybe even less, be
Hmm.
actually deploying solutions. That's what I'm seeing. It's interesting in some of these conferences, a lot of discussions about it, but they almost always are prototypes. Like, yeah,
Uh-huh.
we're looking at this now, we're seeing what it does, but I'm not seeing a lot of companies saying this is what we're doing. Now, there's some bias with that because if you find something that works really well, you're not as likely to tell everyone about it at a conference. But so even taking that into account, I do think there is a lot of excitement and interest, but it's not an easy thing to do. So it's like wrestling that tiger to the ground kind of thing. Then I think people are discovering how difficult it is.
Yeah, we've had several podcasts on this show here regarding generative AI and kind of moving towards that and what it takes to, get started even before you do all of the things to build an application, put it in production. It just seems like there's so much involved that I'm not surprised to hear,
Mhm.
you're also experiencing a lot of that same stuff. So, okay, in the few cases that you have seen, these companies that have been able to get, something at least into a prototype stage or even into deployment, what sort of applications are companies building specifically for retail? And are they making use of their company data? I'm sure they must be, right?
Yes, and most often the first place I see people going are the chatbot idea. How do
Yeah.
we interface with our shoppers, consumers, with our clients, and try to be more responsive, more efficient with those. But those are really challenging. I think people have discovered that. I've spoke with some like in financial services, and it's very difficult because sometimes The challenge is because of the hallucinations we get with Gen AI. It's a real tricky thing. How do you reduce those? A lot of the research has been how to layer something on top of chatbots to try to detect when you're hallucinating and saying something
Hmm.
that's not following our company policies. And, there's some infamous examples that I'm sure we've all seen out there about whether it's legal or whatever. When there, especially when there are requirements, regulatory requirements, it's a real challenge to do that. So that's what I see most often. Um, I'm starting to see other people try to connect it with predictive analytics and trying to do more automation with generative AI. So I've taught a workshop in the past on Gen AI and what I would call predictive AI, and the synthesis of those two with auto machine learning. And the thing that's interesting about that, I've seen people after those workshops, they've actually gone out and built like thousands of models automatically
Wow.
in a vertical to try to figure out. But even there, they're trying to figure out, okay, how do we monetize this? Because it's that's really a challenge too, and that's more retail and financial services based as well. So yeah, it is a real challenge. The ideas are there, the understanding is there of how to do it, but then how to make it work for the retail, for the consumer, especially without having the kind of the downsides, the negatives of Gen AI has that's where a lot of the research has gone.
Yeah, it does feel like every so often we hear another one of these chatbot kind of horror stories for companies that have gone. I mean, certainly there was quite a few of the very, beginning stages of this whole Gen AI buzz, but even still, I've heard recently in news of another chatbot that's not not doing what it's supposed to be doing. So, and it does make sense why companies would start there, of course.
Yes.
So. You mentioned a couple challenges though, regarding, monetization, I think you just mentioned there. What other sort of challenges are companies facing as they, start this, maybe if they want to start, to put something into a prototype or actually get something out and deployed, what
Yeah,
sort of challenges
what
are they facing?
definitely one of the challenges that from a technical standpoint, it's not that hard to put something together. So especially with like this latest generation of computer science and statistics and data science graduates, everyone has experience with it. Most of us have used, whether it's ChatGPT or some other engine. I've got a lot of friends who build their own, customized
Fun. Yeah.
uh, chatbot or search engine on top of one of the engines that are out there. So that's not that hard. But interfacing and getting those business requirements is always a challenge because then what do you want? What do you ultimately want the outcome to be? It's not just interacting with it. So, for example, like with a financial services company, if you're trying to assist people in finding the right document,
Mm.
uh, you've got to make sure that those business requirements are there so that, and that gets to what I was describing before. One of the challenges, make sure that the information is correct and not, we can say the hallucination effects, but it's making a guess, and the guess may be wrong. And unfortunately, sometimes the guess references a document that doesn't exist, and maybe a URL that doesn't even exist. So that part of it, to get those requirements clear and get the legal language around what the consumer can expect from the chatbot, that's where I think a lot of the practical um, I guess that last leg to deploy it takes place. In terms of monetization, though, uh, it seems to me, and I've read some papers around this, that as much as we're talking in terms of things like, oh, like 80% of Python programmers are going to go away because we're just going to run it through ChatGPT, it's actually so far it seems to be almost the reverse is happening because it's taking a lot longer and the expectations are so high from executives of what the Gen AI solutions can do that it's taking a lot of time to get this stuff done. So instead of turning the crank and just blowing out all this content, it ends up taking a lot longer than people expected, especially since a lot of the execs don't really know what they really want. They know at a high level what they want, but operationally to get that sweet spot of what they want. So it's not fulfilled on what the hopes were yet, at least at a broad scale.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think part of the whole like timeline that you touched on, I think is very important because, the assumption is this will help everything move faster. And so like why can't we move faster to get to this thing to help us move faster? So like that all that pressure I think can build up, especially when they don't know all the necessarily the things that it takes to get things going, right? And then the challenges in getting them put together, as you so eloquently put there. And any specific mistakes that you're seeing organizations make? And we talked about challenges, but if there's one, piece of advice for people to avoid, maybe something, what if you have that, what would that be?
Yeah, and I do think related to what we've been discussing so far, the expectations, getting expectations in line with reality is probably the biggest issue that uh you these are inferential engines, and they're not good. It's not some people there's sometimes it's a mistake, people thinking that generative AI is like a better Google search.
Right.
It's just looking things up.
Yeah.
And really that's not what's happening at all. I mean, it's not a Google search. It is predictive. It's making a guess based upon the corpus of documents it was used to train. So understanding those limitations are helpful. And I think from the technical standpoint, it behooves the tech teams to show examples early on in the process with those prototypes so that the stakeholders can see what's coming out of it. And that will help kind of align expectations with the reality. So yeah, I would say that's probably the biggest thing that I'm seeing. It's just expectations are really out of whack. It feels, I'll tell you, because I'm an old guy, this feels so early 90s to me. With the neural networks were huge then,
Hmm.
and really trying to grow, and the expectations were just so outpaced what the reality was. So hopefully we're going to reach that steady state
Yeah.
before too long where those expectations and the alignment with what it can actually be done will be more closely matched.
Well, that's a good point. That's a good point. And yeah, I feel like a lot of times in this industry, things are cyclical. I mean, maybe that's the case for many industries, but certainly you touched on a good one there. I think that was a great callback. Okay, I want to shift into the actual session that you'll be giving during our virtual summit here, Dean. And for folks, it's from promise to practice unlocking the potential of generative AI. A lot of what we just were talking about, of course, but Dean, can you give us maybe a preview of one or two of these best practices for addressing the challenges that we'll be talking about? I know maybe you just did there with the expectation thing. Maybe that's a good first best practice, but can you share maybe one or two without going into giving everything away from your session for folks?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to give two particular use cases that we've started at Appriss Retail related to Gen AI, and I'll mention one of them in particular because I think it's helpful. It's a paradigm shift in this sense, and instead of leveraging Gen AI to do the things that you see most often, like the chatbot example, like what things can it do? What kinds of ideation can it do and help us with? And one of the things we've done is use it to help business analysts who don't understand SQL or programming, to use natural language to build queries.
Hmm.
So then the nice thing about that is it doesn't require loading up PII, which is another issue that I didn't even address before. That's one of the huge issues with organizations
Right.
to protect their the PII of their clients and not put that out there inadvertently out there. But if you could do that, and so if the application just knows like how the data shape, the data schemas, variable names, has examples of the kind of queries that people most commonly write to generate. Like for example, show me all the cash registers in the last week who have higher than average voids or cancels or overrides, those kinds of things, to build those kind of reports. And you can do that very easily with generative AI and do something. And then you don't have the hallucination problem because the worst case here, because it's not outward facing, it's more inwardly facing. It'll generate the report and then the human in the loop, which is always a great safeguard with any of these kinds of solutions. But a human in the loop can look at it and say, "Oh yeah, does this make sense? Is this the right kind of query?" Because they're just doing higher end analysis,
Hmm.
and that saves a ton of time for business analysts who aren't particularly adept at writing queries. And it saves us time on the Appriss side because we don't have to figure out all the different ways people want to interact with the data because they can just build it on the fly.
Hmm. Well, that's excellent. That's really cool. Um, did you say you wanted to share a secondary best practice there, or was that two in one?
That's kind of a two in one.
Perfect. That's
And then
perfect.
there's another example I'll save for the talk itself that is more language based.
Perfect. No, no, no. Yeah, I didn't want to step on the toes
I want
of
to
the
tease a
virtual
little bit,
summit.
yeah.
Yeah, for folks that want, that's a great teaser for folks that are interested. I will go ahead, of course, and put a link into the virtual summit for folks, and you can join in and listen to the whole talk. I'll be there myself, of course. Dean, it was an absolute pleasure talking with you today. Before I let you go, I have one last question. If people were interested in reaching out to you after hearing this, or after seeing your session in a couple weeks, what would be the best way for them to get in contact with you?
People can contact me either email or on LinkedIn. You can search me on LinkedIn. I'll pop up easily. Or my email address is dabbott@apprissretail.com. Dabbott at apprissretail.com. So be happy to interact with anybody.
Perfect. Well, thank you again, Dean. It was an absolute pleasure. I know your talk is going to be great. I'm very much looking forward to our virtual summit. So we'll see each other then, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you so much. I'm looking forward to. Take care.
To subscribe to the Speaking of Data podcast, or to learn more about TDWI's research and training on all things data management and analytics, visit tdwi.org or click the link in the description below. Thanks for tuning in.